Hey guys, in this video we're going to be going over how you can implement the search for a location feature into the app. So for this instance, you can search for the properties in Miami Beach, and if you want to search outside of that, we're going to implement that functionality as well. So without further ado, let's get into it. So for both iOS and Android, whenever this input is pressed, a new screen will pop up and then you can enter in a location, and after 3 characters it will fetch autocomplete options from the server, and then the user can press on these options. The only difference is the layout of the screens on iOS and Android. So for iOS, you can just pull this down and it will go back to your previous screen, but that functionality doesn't really exist on Android. So this is what the screen will look like on Android. It's got pretty much the same functionality, except that here there's a cancel button. So in order for the user to go back, they have to press this cancel button. They can't just scroll down here. So we'll have to take that into account, but otherwise we'll pretty much build out the same screen. So to get started, we're going to be using a service called Location IQ. It has an autocomplete feature that allows us to look up locations and get similar locations as to what we typed in. So go ahead and sign up for it if you haven't already, or log in if you already have an account. So after you signed up for it and got your API access token, just copy that token and let's get started on building out our server. So for our server, we're going to be using Go. If you don't have this installed, go to their documentation and just install it for your system, and then head to wherever you want to store this project. For me, that's going to be on my desktop. And then make a new directory. I'm going to call mine apartments-clone-server. Now change into that directory. And once you've done that, run go mod init. And you can pretty much call this whatever you want, but I'm going to stick with apartments-clone-server. Now let's open it in our text editor. And in the root here, let's create a new file called main.go. And at the top, we'll say package main. And let's import fmt. Then create our main function and just say fmt.print hey there. And this is just to make sure that Go is working. We've got everything set up correctly. So in your terminal, run go run main.go, and you'll see it's printing out hey there. So everything is working. So now let's get started in installing dependencies. So for our first dependency, we're going to be using go.env. So just copy this, which is go get github.com/joho/go.env, and come back to your terminal and paste that in. Okay, with that installed, we'll create a .env file. And then let's create a variable called location_token. And let's go back to our API dashboard and copy our token over. And next, let's create a .getignore file and type in .env. And I'm going to create a .env example. Say location_token. And this will be for anyone either forking this code or downloading it, so they have an example of the environment variables I'm using. So at the top of the main function, say go.env, and that should automatically import, and say load. And that will load the environment variables. Now our next dependency is a web framework called Iris. So run this command, go get github.com/cataras/iris/v12 @master. Underneath the loading of our environment variables, we'll initialize a new app. We'll say app is equal to iris.default. And underneath of this, we'll create some new endpoints. So we'll create a new variable called locations. And it will be equal to app.party. And then this is where we'll put in our base endpoint. So that will be -API-location. And then within this, and let's call it location. And within this, we'll have our autocomplete and also a search endpoint. So let's create those by saying location.get/autocomplete. And then we're gonna have to create a function to pass in here. Here they call it a handler, but pretty much we pass a context into that function, and then based upon that, we can then return some results to whoever is calling this endpoint. And underneath, so let's copy this and paste it and change this to say search. Next, let's create a new folder called routes. And in there, let's create a new file called location.go. The package for this is going to be routes. And we need to create a function called autocomplete and make sure to capitalize it so that we can use it in our main function. And we also need to create a function called search. So autocomplete is going to be calling the autocomplete API endpoint from LocationIQ, and then search is going to be calling the search endpoint from LocationIQ. And each of these is going to be taking in a context, which is of the type iris.context. So within autocomplete, let's create a new variable called limit and assign that to a string of 10. And then a new variable called location, and that's going to be getting the location parameter from the context, which will be passed in through the URL. And then limit query, which will be a limit passed into the URL. Here we're just going to be setting it to 10 by default, but we need to handle the case where limit is actually passed in. So we'll say if limit is not equal to an empty string, then limit needs to be equal to our limit query. Now underneath of that, we'll get our API key, and we'll say API key is equal to os.getEnd location_token. So we need to import OS here, and this is how you can get any environment variable. So underneath of that, we'll create a URL variable, and that will be equal to api.locationiq.com/v1/autocomplete.php. It will have the query parameters of key, which will be equal to our API key, q, which will be equal to our location, and then limit, which will be equal to our limit. Now underneath our URL, let's create a new variable called client, and this will represent the HTTP client we'll be using to call that API. So let's now import HTTP, and underneath of that, we'll actually call the server by creating a new GET request and then passing in the URL. And underneath of that, we'll get the response and any errors by doing client.do, then passing in our request. And then in Go, how you error handle is that you say if the error is not equal to nil, then that pretty much means you should act on the error. So here we'll say if location error is not equal to nil, then we'll say context.stop with problem. And for the status code, we'll say iris.status internal server error, which you can see here is equal to 500. And then we will create a new problem saying iris.new problem. And from here, we can give the problem a title. So we'll say internal server error. And we can also give it some detail. So I'm going to say internal server error on the detail as well. And after that, we just want to return. Now, if we have a response and don't have a location error, we actually want to defer closing the body of the response. So we'll say defer res.body.close. And then we will read the body of the response by saying ioutil.readAll and then passing in the body. And here we need to import ioutil from IO. Now, if we have a body error, we need to say to the user that we're having problems. So let's respond to that. And within this, we'll just copy what we have above and paste it here. And because the response is going to be a JSON object, we need to unmarshal that. So we'll create a new variable, and I'm going to call it object map, which will be an array of string hash maps. Next, we need to unmarshal the body of the response into that object map. So let's use JSON and import that here. And then we need to handle the JSON error if it exists. And we will just do the same thing as we did above. Now, if we reach to the end here, we will be able to return our API response. So let's do that by saying context.json and then passing in our object map. Now this logic will be the same that we use in our search function. So let's cut it and create a new function called fetch locations. It needs to take our URL, which will be a string, and context, which will be iris.context. And we can paste in here what we just copied. Now underneath the URL, we will just say fetch locations and pass in the URL and our context. So with that done, let's go back to our main.go file. We need to pass in a handler for our autocomplete. So let's say routes.autocomplete. And then underneath of here, let's listen on port 4000. So say app.listen and then specify the port of 4000. Now back in our terminal, let's say go run main.go. And here you'll see that we're missing a handler for search, but autocomplete does exist. So let's try it out. I'm going to go to Postman, and here we're going to make a new GET request. Say http://localhost port 4000 /API /location /autocomplete, and then query location is going to be San Diego. And there we go, it's working. So here we did get 10 responses, so let's set a limit now. Say limit will be 2. And let's send. And now we get 1 and 2. Alright, now let's go back and create the search function. And to start off our search function, we can just copy what we have for our location up here. We can also copy the API key and URL. And here in the search, we just need to change the URL. So it says search instead of autocomplete. The key is going to be the same. Q will be the same. And here on the end, we'll say format equals JSON and then delete this end part. And down at the bottom, we can also just copy what we have above and paste. Now let's go back to main.go and pass in the handler here. So we'll say routes.search, and let's start up the server again. And go back to Postman, switch out autocomplete for search, and get rid of limit, and press send. And here we have a different schema, so we are reaching a different endpoint. So here I am back on the front end of our application in the file called constants. I'm going to add some new variables for those endpoints that we just created. So the first one is going to be called server URL. It's going to be the URL that we get whenever we run expo start. So here you can see a URL with a port and an IP address. Just copy this IP address and prepend it with HTTP. And then for the port, we're going to be using 4000 on our server. And then for the base endpoint, we're going to have API. So follow 4000 with /API. Our next variable is going to be location, and it's going to represent our location endpoint. And then we just need to tie these two together in a variable called location endpoint. So that'll be server URL plus location. And then let's create a new object called endpoints. So in there we'll have a search endpoint, which will be the location endpoint followed by /search. And we'll also have an autocomplete endpoint, which will be location endpoint plus the autocomplete. Next, we're going to create some services, which will call these endpoints. So let's create a folder called services. In that folder, let's create a file called location.ts. Let's go into our terminal and install Axios. And up here at the top, import Axios from Axios. Then import endpoints from our constants. And here we're also going to need to import a type, which we have yet to create. So let's create a new type here in our types folder. We're going to call it locationIQ.ts. And then we're going to export this type. So all of these are going to be strings with the exception of bounding box, which will be a string array. So just copy these down and save that. And then go back to location. And then import location from locationIQ. And now let's create a new function called getSuggested_locations. It's going to take a text, which will be a string, and a limit, which can be a number. And the limit's going to be optional. The text is going to represent the location that the user is trying to search for. So let's create a try catch block. In the try block, let's create a variable called final limit and assign it to 8. Now, if we get a limit passed in, let's change final limit to the passed in limit. And then let's utilize our endpoints and get our autocomplete endpoint and append some query parameters to it, such as location, which will be equal to text, and the limit, which will be equal to the final limit. Then we need to make a GET request to this URL and await it, and we need to destructure that request for the data. And if there is data, we need to return it. And as you can see, that data is going to be in the form of a location array. And if we don't have any data, we just need to return an empty array. Now in our catch block, we want to console.error any error that we get and return an empty array. Now for search, let's just copy this and paste below. We can get rid of the limit stuff and let's call it search locations. And we can also get rid of the limit parameter. Here we can get rid of this. And let's switch out the autocomplete endpoint for search endpoint. And that will be the search locations function. With these functions created, we now need to create a screen which will actually be able to use them. So let's create a new screen here called FindLocationsScreen. FindLocationsScreen.tsx. And let's copy over what we have in our saved screen to FindLocationsScreen. Now let's go into our types. And this is going to be a modal. So we need to put FindLocationsScreen here, or find locations, and it's going to take undefined for right now. and make sure to add that to the root stack param list. Now let's go to our index file, so p index, and here we need to import our FindLocationsScreen. And let's copy this, but then we need to paste it into our second stack group and change the name of root to FindLocations, and it should autocomplete. Change bottom tab navigator to FindLocationsScreen, and header shown should be false. So with this implemented, we can get to the screen by touching on the top input, which is on the search screen and on the map. So that is going to be our component of header input. So here we need to import use navigation. We need to first create a variable called navigation, which is equal to use navigation. And for our onPress event, we'll say navigation.navigate to find locations. Now let's go back to our find location screen and start to build this out. Screens that we're looking to build out. This is the Android version and this is the iOS version. As you can see, on iOS you have the capability of just pulling this tab down and that will actually get rid of this screen. But on Android they don't have that, so we have to use a cancel button. So that's one thing that we'll have to customize for whether we're on Android or on iOS. But other than that, we can just copy over the rest and use those on both screens. So let's get to that. So here, let's create a new component called ModalHeader. .tsx. For our imports, we're going to import material community icons, view, style sheet, and view style from React Native, text from UI Kitten, and use navigation from React Navigation. And then we need to import theme locally and row from our row component. Let's create our style sheet below here. And then in the middle, let's create our component. So the modal header has the possibility to take in 3 props. Those props are going to be x shown, text, and style. X shown will represent a closing X in the top left here. The text will be displayed in the center, and style, well, that will just be any additional styles that we want to pass in. So if we have text here, then we're going to display the text. Otherwise, we'll display what you see on screen here. So here we'll say if we have text, then we want to return a row. And within that row, we'll have a text component with a category of H5, and we'll just be displaying the text. Otherwise, we would just want to return a view within a view. And now we need to account for whether or not the X is shown. So here within our row component above the text, we will say if the X is shown, then we want to display a material community icon with the name of close, a color of our color-gray from our theme, and a size of 24. And we also want to add some styles and an onPress event here. For the onPress event, we need to say navigation.goBack. So let's create our navigation variable. So here's our navigation variable. And as a matter of fact, we can just actually change this to black for the color. Now for our styles, we need to create a new style for this. The style is going to be called X, and that's going to have a position of absolute, left of 10, and align self to center. Now we need to add another style here. It's going to be called container. It's going to have the properties of align items to center, justify content to center, padding of 15, border bottom width of 1, and a border bottom color of hashtag A4, A4, A4. And we're going to put that on our view here and our row. So here on our row, we'll say styles is equal to an array, which has the first index equal to styles.container, and then the second index will be the passed in style. And we have to specify as view style here, or else we're getting a type error. And we can just copy this and paste it below. Now for our second view here, we can create another style called bar. It will have a width of 50, background color of hashtag A4A4A4, height of 4, and border radius of 30. And let's add that on right here. And we can get rid of theme for the import since we're no longer using it. Now let's go back to our Find Location screen. Now let's change our top level import to platform. And let's change this to say platform.os equal to iOS. Then we'll display our modal header. And that just auto imported. Otherwise, we'll display nothing. And I'm going to move that down. And next we're going to need to import input, button, and text from UIKitten. Then create a new function called getInput. So depending on whether or not we're on Android or iOS, we need to add this button up to the top level input. So that's what we're going to be doing in this function. But our inputs are going to need a couple of imports or new functions which we need to create. So let's import our theme. Let's import useState from React. And let's create a new state called value. And it's going to be a string. And it will initialize it to empty. Now here within our get input, we'll say if platform.os is equal to iOS, then we will return a new input. The keyboard type will be equal to default. Autofocus will be true. Selection color is going to be our color primary -500. The placeholder will be enter location. Size is going to be large. Our value is going to be equal to value. On change text is going to be equal to handle change. On submit editing will be equal to another function which we need to create, which will be handle submit editing. And then styles will be equal to a style which we will need to create. So let's create our styles first. So import style sheet from React Native. And down here, let's create our styles. Now let's create default margin top, which will have a margin top of 10. Now above our input, let's create our handle change and handle submit editing. For handle change, it will be an asynchronous function which takes in a text value as a parameter. And we can just copy and paste this, get rid of the parameter here, and change this to handle submit editing. It'll also be asynchronous, but we can use the value here instead of a passed in value. Here back in our get input function, if it's on Android, we'd just like to return a row, which we'll need to import. And within that row, we'll be returning an input, except that the style will also have a width of 80%. And next to the input, we need to display a button which says cancel. And the appearance will be ghost. The status is going to be info, and on press will be navigation.goback. So let's create our navigation variable, and I'll put it right beneath value. And we're going to need to import use navigation. So with get input created, let's add that underneath our modal header. So get input and just call that. And looking back at this, we also need to add some padding horizontally to all of our content here. So let's do that by just wrapping this in a view. And let's import that from React Native. Okay. And let's create a new style to give this a padding horizontal. We'll call the style screen content, and it'll have margin horizontal of 10. And let's just add that style here. Screen content. So for handle change, let's build that out right now. First thing we want to do is set the value equal to the passed in value. And if the length of the value is greater than 2, that's when we can start making calls to that API. So let's import that service here. Import get suggested locations. And then we'll say const locations equals await get suggested locations. And we just need to pass in the val. And if locations.length is greater than 0, then we'll set a new state variable equal to the locations. So let's create that variable right now. And we'll call it suggestions. And set suggestions, which will be equal to a new state, which is an empty array. And this will be of the type location array. And we're going to be importing locations from location IQ, which is in our types folder. Now here, set suggestions to the locations array. And then here we need to specify else if val.length is equal to 0, we'll set suggestions to an empty array. Now for handle submit editing, we're just going to copy what we have here. And then instead of val here, we'll say value. And if locations.length is equal to 0, then we would like to navigate back to our search screen and specifically onto the map. So we'll say console.log navigate to search screen, passing in locations sub 0. And eventually we'll get to that. We just need to build out the rest of the screen, specifically the autocomplete portion. So with this implemented, we should now be able to get our suggestions through this handle change event. So let's implement a flat list underneath our get input to display our results that get returned from the server. So let's import flat list up here. And touchable opacity. And we'll say suggestions.length is greater than 0. And make sure to put this in this view. Then we will want to display a flat list. Otherwise, we'll just say null for right now. But really here we're gonna be displaying recently searched items and the get current location feature. So that will be something to come. Our data is gonna be equal to suggestions. Shows vertical scroll indicator is false. For our key extractor, we just want to return the item.place_id plus the index. And for render item here, we're going to be returning a touchable opacity with an onPress event that just logs the item to the console for the time being. And then we need to create a new component called suggested text, which will get a clean version of the item's text or where the item is located. So let's create that right now. So this function will be suggested text, and it will take in a prop of location item, which will be the type of location. And inside of it, we'll have to get the location from another function that we're going to create. It's going to be called get formatted location text, just so that the location text looks pretty and legible. And we'll return that location text within a row component. And we just need to give that row some styles. These styles are going to be a suggestion container, so we'll create that right here. It's going to have the properties of align items to center, padding of 15, border bottom width of 1, and a border bottom color of theme and our color dash gray. Now for get formatted location text, let's create that here. It will be a function that takes in an item, which is a location. We're going to say let the location be equal to item.address.name, because this is on every single item. But if the item is of type of city and it has a state, then we need to append a comma and then add in that item.address.state and finally return the location. So with that implemented, let's go and check it out. But first, go back to your server and make sure that you run here, go run main.go. Alright, so with our base level of auto completion built out, we need to now navigate back to the map whenever we press on a certain component or we submit a certain location. So to do that, let's create a new function called handle navigate, and we're going to pass in an item, which is the type of location, into this function. And with that, we're going to navigate to our route, and specifically we're going to navigate to the search screen, passing in some parameters to this screen. So we're going to have a location property, which will be our formatted location text, a latitude, here we'll call it lat, which will be equal to our location.lat, a lawn, which will be location.lawn, and a bounding box, which will be the location.bounding box. So here we're getting type errors because we haven't added these types to this search screen. So let's go back to our types file and add these in. So go over here and create a new type. Let's call it search screen params, and make sure to export this. It's going to have the property of location, which will be a string, bounding box, which will be a string array, lat, which is a string, and lawn, which is a string. And here where it says root tab param list, search can either be undefined or it can be search screen params. Back here in handle navigate, let's change this parameter to say location. Also here in our handle submit editing function, let's change this to say handle navigate to location sub 0. And let's change this console.log in our touchable opacity in the flat list to handle navigate, passing in the item. So now head to your search screen and import useEffect from React, and also import search screen params from types. So for the parameters, it's going to take in an object which has the property of root, and then within that object there is a property called params, and that's where we can get our search screen params from. And this hierarchy remains constant whenever you're using React navigation, so we will be using this for other screens. And then beneath that, we need to create a useEffect, and if we have root.params, we need to animate the map camera. But because we don't have a ref to our map, we need to go do some refactoring to our map so that we can pass in a ref that we just define up here. So let's go to our map. So here we actually need to get rid of the map ref and put it in our search screen and then pass that into the map. So let's add in that parameter here, or prop, and we're going to call it map ref because that's what we're calling it here. We'll call it map ref and assign it the type of a react.mutable_ref object, which can either be map view or null. And now let's cut this here, save, and looks like we don't have any type errors, so that's good. Let's go back into our search screen and paste this here. Let's import useRef from React and import map view from React Native Maps. You can move this up. Now for map here, let's pass in the mapref, which is equal to mapref. And if we have root.params, let's say mapref.current.animateCamera. And then we need to pass in an object here. We'll say center. And then the latitude is going to be equal to root.params.lat. And we also need to change this to a number because this is what it is expecting. Let's cast that to a number. And then for longitude, let's do the same, but say root.params.long. And also here in our map, we need to add another prop called initial region. And initial region will be of the type region or undefined, and region is coming from React Native Maps. And then down here in our map view, it also takes in a prop called initial region. So we will pass in our initial region if it exists. Otherwise, we'll pass in undefined. So for a map component here, let's add in a new prop for that initial region. And if root.params exists, we'll pass in an object which contains a latitude equal to our root.params.lat, and that's going to be typecasted to our number, a longitude, which will be the same just for longitude, and then a latitude delta of 0.4 and longitude delta of 0.4. But if it doesn't exist, we're just going to pass in undefined. Now let's go and test it out. Now we need to display the recently pressed location in the input box whenever we're on the map screen. And we also need to implement these components of useMyCurrentLocation and recent searches. So to display the recently pressed item in the input box, we need to go to our animated list header and create a new prop for it. We're going to call that prop location. And if we have root.params, we need to pass in the root.params.location. Otherwise, we're just going to pass in find a location. And let's head back to our animated list header. And here we need to create a new prop. We're going to call it location, and that's going to be a string. And then here in our header input, we're going to pass in location into that. So now let's go into our header input and do the same thing. And we just need to create a prop here of location, which is the type of string. And here we're saying find a location. Let's just display location. Alright guys, so here I am back on the find location screen, and now we want to build out this use my current location component as well as these recent searches component, which we will cache the recent searches made by the user and display them here. So let's get to that. And the first thing I'm going to do is where we conditionally render here saying suggestions.length is greater than 0, and then render this flat list, otherwise we'll render null. We need to, instead of rendering null here, render a scroll view, and that's going to be imported from React Native, and we'll just say bounces equals false. And within the scroll view, we'll have those two components. So the first being this use my current location button, and then the second one being these recent searches that we've made. So let's get started on creating this use my current location button.
Let's go to our components here and create a new file called current location button.tsx. Alright, so the first thing we need to do is import some components. So first thing is import touchable opacity, style sheet, and view style from React Native. Next, import text from UI Kitten. Then import font awesome from Expo Vector Icons. Import use navigation from React Navigation. Import row from row. And import theme from our theme file. Next, let's create our component. It'll be current location button, and the only prop it'll take is a style, which will be an optional view style. And then let's create our styles below. And within our current location button, we need to return a row, which will be taking the styles of styles.container and style as view style. And then within this row, we want to return a font awesome icon. The name is going to be location-arrow. The size is 30. It will have a style of styles.icon and a color of theme, and then color-primary of 500. And below that, or rather next to that, we'll have a touchable opacity, which will have an onPress event, which we need to create this function, but it will be an asynchronous function, and we will just await the getLocation function. And within that touchable opacity, we'll have a text, which will have the styles of styles.text and the status of info, and it will say use my current location. Now defining our styles, styles.container will have the property of align items, and it will be center. Next, icon will have the property of margin left, and that will be a value of 5. And text will have a property of margin left equal to 10 and a font weight of 600. Next, let's create our navigation variable, saying const navigation is equal to use navigation. And then we need to install a new package called expo-location. Here are the docs for it if you want to look up anything for this. So open up the terminal, open up a new terminal here, and I'm going to say expo install expo-location. And with that installed, let's go back to the documentation and just use this import statement here and paste that here. Now let's create our getLocation function. It will be asynchronous, as I said before. And then we need to await location.request foreground permissions async, and specifically we need to get the status from that. So we're going to destructure here, and if the status is not equal to granted, then we're going to alert to the user that permission to access location was denied. So we can't really do anything in order to look up their location because they denied it. So we're just going to return here. But if they granted us their location, then we can use the function getCurrentPositionAsync, and this will return a location object. And from there, we can use that location object to navigate to our search screen. So we need to create a new function called handleNavigate. It will take in a parameter of location.locationObject. We will be getting the latitude from location.chords.latitude and the longitude from location.chords.longitude. And then we need to create a bounding box because this location object doesn't have anything like that. So for the first item, we're going to do lat minus 0.048, and then we need to convert that to a string. Second will be lat plus 0.048, .toString. Third will be longitude, or lon, minus 0.041, .toString. And then fourth will be plus 0.041, .toString. And for these numbers, I just saw what our API responses were calculating and used something similar. Now with these variables created, we now like to navigate to our root and specifically the search screen. passing in the parameters of your current location for the location property. The bounding box will just be our bounding box here. The lat will be lat.toString, and then lawn will be lawn.toString. And we will save that here and go back to FindLocationsScreen. And then let's display it here. So current location button. And let's create a new style for this. So we'll open up styles and paste in current location button, which will have the property of margin top, and it will be equal to 40. So let's add that here. Style equals styles.current location button. All right, let's go and check it out. Also, if you're getting permission to access location was denied, just go into your settings and search for Expo Go, and then allow location for your device. And that will allow you to test this out. So with that created, let's go into the next portion, which will be this recent searches. So the next thing that we need to do is use React Query and install this into our project. We'll be using it for most of our asynchronous state management. I'm saying most because this is asynchronous state that we are not using it for, and this being the suggested text. And the reason that is because React Query allows you to cache, and quite frankly, we don't need to cache these suggestions. So that's why we aren't using it here. But other than that, we'll be using it to cache our recent suggestions. So let's get to installing that, and open up your terminal and just go yarn add or npm install react-query. And with that installed, let's go into our app file. So app.tsx. Then import query client and query client provider from React Query. Create a new query client object, and then wrap your application in the query client provider, and then just move all this stuff into that component. And here we want to pass in the prop of client equal to query client. And you should know that the cache is, I believe, 5 minutes for this. We can change it later, but that's what I'm going to keep it at for right now. So with that done, let's get started on building out this recent searches. So for that, let's create a new component, and we'll call it recent search button. So recent search button.tsx. As always, we'll start with our imports. So first thing we need to do is import style sheet, touchable opacity, and view style from React Native. Import material community icons from Expo Vector Icons, text from UIKitten, and theme from our theme file. Next, let's export our component. It will be a function called recent search button. It will take in the props of name, onPress, and style. Name is a string, onPress will be an optional void function, and style will be an optional view style. And then beneath this, let's create our styles. Within this function, let's return a touchable opacity. We'll have the style of styles.container, and then our passed in style, and then the onPress event will be equal to the passed in onPress. It will also display a material community icon with the name equal to clock-time-3-outline. The size of that will be 24, and the color will be equal to theme, and then our color-primary-500. And then next to that will be the text. The style will be equal to styles.text, and it will be rendering out our name that we're passing in. So for our container style, it will have a padding vertical of 12, padding horizontal of 5, border color of theme color-gray, border width of 1, border radius of 10, a flex direction of row, and align items to center. And text will have the property of margin left equal to 10. Now with the buttons created, we now need to create a component that will display the buttons in a list. So let's create that right now. In our components folder, let's create a new component called recent search list.tsx. Now our first import is going to be useState from React, import views, style sheet, and view style from React Native, button from UI Kitten, use navigation from React Navigation, location from our types/location IQ file, and recent search button from our recent search button that we just created. Next, let's export our component. It will be taking in two props. One will be recent searches, which will be optional because it can be undefined. And the type for that will be a location array. And again, location is coming from location IQ. And the second prop will be a style, which is again optional, and it will be equal to view style. Now underneath of that, create your styles variable. Now we want to return a view with the style equal to the passed in style. And the reason that we're creating get list is because depending on how long recent searches is, we'll display a different list of the components. So before we can create get lists, we need to create a new state called show more and set show more, and we're gonna initialize that to false. Now let's create the get list function, and within get list we'll say if recent searches is undefined or recent searches.length is equal to 0, we'll just return. Otherwise, if recent searches.length is greater than 2 and show more is false, we want to return a new fragment, and within that we need to map through our recent searches. And if index is less than 2, we want to display a recent search button with the key being equal to i.display_name plus the index. The name will be equal to get formatted location text, and then we'll pass in I. And for this, we're going to be using what we use here, get formatted location text. So let's create a new folder called utils, and then within that, let's create get formatted location text.ts. And let's just paste in what we have here. And we just need to import location from types/location IQ. And then here we need to export the function. Now back here, we'd like to import this from utils and then get formatted location text. Now back in our recent search list, let's just do the same, control period and import that. And then on press, we'll be creating that later. So if index is less than 2, we'll be displaying that. Okay, whatever. Otherwise, we'll be displaying null. And at the bottom of this, we want to create a button which says see more, and I'll be creating this button in a few. Let's just get to the other option here. So if this is not the case, then we want to return a fragment and just map through all of the recent searches. And then at the bottom, if recent searches.length is greater than 2, we would like to show a button which says see less. So for the styles of recent search button, we're just gonna say that it's got a property of margin vertical, and that's equal to 5. For our show button here, let's create a component locally. It'll be taking in a text prop, which will be a string, and then let's return a button with the appearance of ghost, the status of info, a style of align self to flex start, and then on press will be handle button press. And then here, let's move this to our styles. So we'll say styles.show button. Show button. And now let's create this handle button press function. And handle button press will simply say set show more to the opposite of show more. And then for handle recent search button press, we'd like to create a new function here, passing in a location, which we're already doing. And then we're going to navigate to our root search screen, and then the location is going to be equal to get formatted location text, passing in our location here. The lat will be equal to location.lat, lawn will be location.lawn, and the bounded box will be location.bounding box. Now we just need to create our navigation variable, and we need to go back into our FindLocationsScreen and add this underneath the current location button. So recent search list. And let's give this component a style. That style is going to be called recent search container, and it will have a property of margin top, which is 30. Now this is missing another component, which is recent searches. So let's create that right now. And to create that, we need to import useQueryClient from React Query. Then here at the top of our function, let's create two variables. The first being queryClient, which is equal to useQueryClient, and the second being recent searches, which will either be a location array or undefined, and then it will be equal to queryClient.get query data of recent searches. And right now this isn't really making sense because we're never setting recent searches anywhere. But whenever we press on a touchable opacity here, we can then set the recent searches to that. So let's do that now. So let's create a new function here called setRecentSearch, which will take in a location with the type of location. And then we'll say queryClient.setQueryData of recent searches, and this will take in a function. And ideally, we'd just like to return the location in an array, but if recent searches exists, then we need to check if that location is already in the array. So we'll create a value here saying let included equals false, and then for each object in the recent searches array, we need to check if the display name is equal to location.displayName. And typically I'd say that this is probably fine, but I'm going to be extra cautious and just say if the longitude of the object in the array is also equal to the longitude of the location object passed in, and the latitude of the object passed in and the object in the array are the same, then we're going to say included is true, and then we'll break out of this loop. Otherwise, if the location is not included, we need to return a new array with that location at the index of 0 in that array. And then for the subsequent items, that's just going to be equal to our recent searches from the past. Also, one minor hiccup here. We need to say if not included, return location. But if it is included, we don't want to return only the location, which is what we're doing right now. We want to return recent searches. And then here in handle navigate at the top of it, we can just say set recent search and pass in the location that we are passing in here. And then here in our recent search list, let's pass in our recent searches. And let's go and test this out. So this video is running pretty long, but in the next one, I'm going to show you how you can allow users to search for properties in an area on the map like this. And we're also going to implement the logic to get areas within this certain map view. And we're also going to add properties to different locations. All this stuff is going to be done on the client, but we can reuse that logic on the back end to achieve the same results. If you have any suggestions, please leave them in the comments. Otherwise, thank you for watching.